The challenge with the way that they're conducting this recount is that you're doing a lot of recanvassing. So, election officials have to follow very specific guidelines and rules and regulations and laws in processing ballots and what ballots are rejected or accepted. So to be able to take, as Tammy so eloquently put, take a box of ballots that has one bit of something, PII in this case, and set those aside, does that mean that they're now not going to count those ballots? And it's that self-fulfilling prophecy. We're just going to take ballots out of the mix. We're going to recanvass this process, and we're going to second guess every judgment that election officials made with disregarding the laws that they were bound to. That sets up a different outcome, which of course just goes to the narrative that they're trying to prove.
Great, thank you both so much. Next, we're going to take a question from Jessica Huseman with VoteBeat.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for doing this today. It's really informative. My question is for Secretary Wyman, and then I'm hoping Mr. Masterson will jump in as well. I think the root of this is pretty deeply and pretty obviously Republican doubts in election integrity. And given that you're both part of that party, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about how this audit is going to help or hurt the ability for some within the Republican Party to get their party back in line in terms of belief in election integrity and appropriate actions following elections if and when they lose.
Well, it's going to be a huge challenge, and I don't try to influence the party or the direction it's going as an election official, but I have deep concerns here in Washington State. Stuart Elway did a poll recently where 60% of Republicans said that they either believe that the election was rigged nationally or that their vote didn't count accurately, and it's just being fueled and replayed over and over again. I've been through a close election in 2004, the closest governor's race in the country's history. And what I saw is that political parties will make their litigation or their challenges to an election based on how they're doing in the count. And when your party's ahead, everything's good. We don't need to do anymore. We should just certify the election. And when you're behind, you're challenging. And both sides do it, and both sides are going to do it to win. And so I think that this is now going to be one more weapon in that arsenal for campaigns and candidates, and I think it's ultimately going to undermine the Republican Party's own activities. We're already seeing where the president's comments in 2020 against absentee balloting, and well, he said absentee balloting was good, but vote by mail ballots were bad and corrupt. And we saw, I think as you do the analysis, you saw a decline in Republican participation. So he suppressed his own voters with those comments. And so it doesn't bode well for a political party to undermine elections. It's going to hurt them ultimately, and I don't know how politically the party realigns if they continue down this path.
I don't have, Secretary Wyman said it great. The best thing the party can do is to be honest with their voters, tell them the truth about this election, and move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt and Secretary Wyman. Tammy, did you want to jump in here quickly?
I was going to tie that into something that was asked in the chat as well. And that is, I think it's important to know that this is not something that is done anywhere else in the country. And not only that, I reached out to some of my colleagues and friends that work for some of the international observation organizations and said, is this done in other states? Is it done or in other countries? Is it done in fledgling democracies? Is it done in autocracies? And they said, no, this is not something that occurs in a healthy democratic process. Once the election is over, the will of the people need to be accepted by all of the people. And that's to say that, we need to make sure we have legislative or litigative channels to verify and validate, and that we do audits and make sure that it's correct. But at that point, we move forward together. And so this is not something that is done anywhere else in the country, let alone anywhere else in the world. And that is where I think it's really problematic, because we know that there are other states that are now looking to this saying, how can we use this type of an action to call into question elections months afterwards, either to raise funds or to energize the base, as was mentioned. And I fear for what our procedures will look like and our elections will look like moving forward, continuing next year. I mean, the midterm is going to be upon us before we, even blink our eyes. And that's what I think is really, really challenging in this moment.
Thank you all so much. Let's move on to Adam Brewster with CBS News.
Hi, thank you for doing this call. I think Secretary Wyman and Tammy might be best for this, but Matt, if you have something to say, feel free to jump in. If the ballots get damaged, Secretary Wyman, as you mentioned, they may in this process, what does that do to them moving forward? Are there certain things that they could not be used for? What's the damage being done if there has been some harm to these ballots moving forward at this point?
Well, I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that when we do an election, we have not only chain of custody issue, controls in place, but we have an audit trail that we're building from the moment we define the election to the moment we certify it. And then states have to keep federal election ballots and ballot materials for 22 months after an election for a reason. If you, for some reason, wanted to go back and do some sort of process that was defined in law or was maybe ordered by a court, you can show that chain of custody that when we sealed this box of ballots, no one has touched them since then. And you're seeing what was captured at the end of the election. Now, Arizona and Maricopa County has opened up a lot of questions because, like I said, how do you know those ballots weren't altered? And it doesn't even matter if they were at this point, because I don't think you can guarantee that they weren't. And that's all you have to do to cast doubt on this process now and say, well, those 3 boxes of ballots, which include 15,000 ballots, were altered, and we can never be sure what they actually said on election day. And that's problematic for confidence. And this is why we maintain tight controls and security measures around ballots and ballot handling, so we can always stand up to those challenges and refute baseless claims. Right now, it's a wide open, wild, wild west as far as I'm concerned. You can't guarantee the ballot security in that environment because that organization has no requirement to do it.
And I would say, because this event seems to be the gift that keeps on giving, or the nightmare that you're not waking up from, depending on your perspective, is that they can be damaged in a variety of ways. We saw, due to the press pool and some of the local reporting over the weekend, that there are literally birds flying around inside the Coliseum over where the official ballots are being counted. That can damage ballots. We'll just leave it at that. We know that the UV ray exposure, there was challenges on whether or not that would denigrate the records. Secretary Wyman mentioned that we have this record retention. If that wasn't in place under federal law, this event could not be going on. But my question, and I think a question that would be great for the press to ask those who are conducting this, is what's going to happen to all of the ephemera that they are creating? Their tally sheets, their logs, their chain of custody, their actual procedures and policies that are potentially a little more robust than what we saw online. What will happen with all of that documentation? Because in the statement of work, they talk about artifacts that they're going to create. And they mention things like a report, but not what's going to happen with all of this other kind of documentation that election officials include in the materials that are retained under federal law for that time. We know that there can be damage. Thank goodness that the Arizona Republic, that Jen Fifield was in as an observer, because she couldn't be in as a press person in the early days of this event, and notice they were using blue pens. We don't know how many blank ballots were marked. We don't know how many ballots were overvoted to negate an existing vote. We don't know if that number is 0 or more than 0. So that's part of the issue with all of this, is not really knowing what exactly they're doing. There was a question around some of the ballot imaging that they're doing. It doesn't appear from the reporting and from observers there now that they're imaging every single ballot. So we don't know what are the criteria of what they're going to take an image of. We don't know what they plan to do with those. We don't know whether or not that's going to be retained with the information and go back to the Maricopa County Elections Department.
The only thing I'd add very, very briefly, because I think both have touched on this, but even just from a legal standpoint, chain of custody, ballot integrity has been so destroyed by a lack of procedures that moved into evolving procedures. I think once the Secretary of State's office and the media had observation, you've seen changes to the process to improve it, but you can't reestablish that chain of custody and integrity after the fact. And so from just a legal standpoint, I don't know how you could establish proper chain of custody, evidence standards, anything for a court or otherwise. In this case, it's gone as soon as those pens showed up in there, as soon as tracking and ballot custody was lost. It cannot be reestablished, and there's no way to prove it after the fact.
Thank you all so much. Tammy, you mentioned Jen Fifield with the Arizona Republic, who has a question in the chat today. Jen asks, a common refrain of supporters of these audits is, quote, "What are you all afraid of? Why not do this audit? So please explain, why not?"
It's such a great question, because that is the common refrain, right? Is, well, you must be hiding something, otherwise we should do this. The real issue, though, is that a hand count audit was already done of these ballots, and has been done since, I think the first time we did it was in 2000, in either 7, 8, or 9. Time can be a blur. I was in Maricopa County when we implemented the hand count audit. I personally have overseen the hand counting of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of ballots, if not millions of ballots over the years. So it's not a question of being afraid of an audit. There were officially sanctioned audits already conducted by the political parties in Arizona. So the way Arizona law is laid out for hand count audit is that the observers and the auditors are all put forth by the political parties. They're the ones picking who's going to handle the ballots, who's going to watch the process, and represent the political parties or the candidates in this action. This is dramatically different from what's happening at the Coliseum right now, where in fact, those who are doing the counting are hand picking, and we don't know what criteria are being used of who will conduct this exercise. So it's not a question of anyone being afraid of having yet another hand count, but the question that I've posed is, to what end? The goalposts keep being moved. So after the election earlier this year, the legislature came up and said, we need to do a forensic audit. So, okay, Maricopa County said, all right, we'll do the forensic audit. And then they came back and said, well, that's no good because you used the 2 certified test laboratories in the entire country that are accredited to do this kind of research and this sort of an audit. So instead, we are going to do this other thing. And now I'm seeing on social media that they're calling this is even in and of itself not going to be sufficient because it wasn't done within the walls of MCTEC, which is the tabulation facility, because it could be that there's something in those walls that's going to impact how the audit is done. And so even if they fulfill this proposed obligation they've put upon themselves at the Coliseum, it's still not going to be sufficient. The goalpost will continue to move, and there is no satisfactory answer to allay some fears of some of the electorate. And therein is the challenge and is the problem. So on the one hand, we need to all be honest and truthful and tell people sometimes the hard truth that your candidate lost. They lost legitimately. And I will tell you that the people who lose elections never believe that they lost. And that's why Arizona has sore loser laws and other places have laws in place, because people won't believe it. But that's why Arizona started a hand count audit almost 15, 16 years ago. And that's where I think the answer is really, no one's afraid of anything. And that's why it's already been audited. It's already been tested. And we need to move forward.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm going to move ahead to Nicole Valdez with ABC 15.
Hi, everyone. I actually have 2 questions. So if you feel like you can answer it, I'd appreciate it. So the first kind of hits on what both Tammy and Kim were talking about, which is the anticipation that whatever report comes out from this exercise, it will likely be different than the results that were already, certified in Arizona. If that is the case, what happens then? I know that there are some that saw what happened in Antrim County, where an audit was conducted there. It said that there were irregularities, that there was fraud. And so Antrim County was forced to go back and do another hand count. But I'm sure, as you're all aware, Antrim County is much smaller than Maricopa County. So would that be something that we would be seeing down the line, or what would be the consequence or really the follow-up to that report? And I'll let you guys answer that first, because the second one's kind of more complicated.
Real quickly on what's in Arizona law, there's nothing in Arizona law that allows for any change to occur in the certified election results that were certified last year at this point in time. And I don't know if Mr. Masterson or others want to weigh in on. My understanding is there's nothing under federal law that changes the certification of the electors or anything else. So there will be no change in who won the election at this point in time, because one, it was a legitimate election. The outcome was already verified and validated and litigated.
And even if there was some magic bullet that they could come up with that would present a legal challenge, I don't see how you could conduct any kind of court action, as Matt so eloquently put earlier, because you've now contaminated all of the evidence. The chain of custody is gone. I have no confidence as an election official that any of those ballots are legitimate now. None. Because there is no way you could verify it. And all it's going to take is a challenger coming in and saying, those 10,000 ballots were remarked. And they can't disprove the allegation because they have no chain of custody, regardless of their made up procedures and policies that they put out in public. They don't reach anywhere near knocking on the door of standards that election officials operate to. We do it so that we can make those arguments in court if needed. We can back up our policies and procedures and show that we followed law and that the election was fair and accurate. They can't do it. They have now contaminated and corrupted all of those, 2.1 million ballots that Maricopa County so meticulously kept control of. Now all of that is gone. So pretty much anything from day forward is just a crapshoot, and the only point of it is to undermine confidence in the results. That is the only end game here.
Thank you. And I think that is kind of what my next question is obviously there may not be any official process that would necessarily happen at this point, but having this all done, having this process already been, done, the report out there, it seems to me like this has just opened the door to an endless possibility of distrust, no matter who you are. I mean, if there are going to be people still that read this report and believe what it says, and there are going to be those that read this report and never believe what it says. And then to Tammy's point, to what end does this exercise, go? And at what point do we look at an election, for example, in 2022 and so forth? And how do we get people back to voting in a way where we don't have to rethink about, this whole process and what we've seen play out today?
Yeah, Nicole, I'll be very brief on this, and Secretary Wyman and Tammy can jump in, but I think you've hit at the crux of the problem. What we know is that this was already part, as I said, of our adversaries' playbook to undermine confidence in our democracy, and now they're watching us do it to ourselves and amplifying that. And so this is now, for election officials that I talk to every day, this is now part of their reality, is struggling with doing everything correctly by the book, canvassing, auditing, litigating, and still being presented with outlandish theories, lies, whatever, to undermine confidence in the democratic process. And the only people that benefit are, as Tammy said, those that are raising money off of this, and more directly, Vladimir Putin and Russia, who get to watch us undermine our own democracy.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn to a question from the chat to close us out. Dan Zach from the Washington Post says, for Tammy in particular, how would Maricopa County elections normally hire temporary election workers? Where do these workers come from? And do we know anything more about how this audit has hired temporary workers, who they are, and where they came from?
So we have temporary workers that work, say, in the tabulation center at McTech, and then you also have the auditors of the hand count audit. So on the one hand, election offices love to bring back the same workers every year, and oftentimes they're retirees, particularly in Arizona, or they're individuals who are available to work every election. They're cyclical workers, and so when it comes to the processing of the ballots on the front end, that's traditionally how that happens. There's backgrounds that are vetted, and there's all sorts of other things that occur there. It's a very open process. They are hired under county guidelines for hiring and employing individuals. Sometimes they might go through a temporary agency. And so you also have the protections there that temporary agencies have around who's being employed and what have you. And as an aside, that's how I started in elections, was in 1998, marking test ballots for a logic and accuracy test for the primary. So I'm a full advocate for starting out as a temporary worker, because none of us wake up one morning and say, I want to be an election official, which is too bad. So setting that aside and looking to the audit, the difference there is that under Arizona law, in order to conduct the hand count audit, the political parties need to bring forth the staffing power to conduct the audit itself. And that's where it's very transparent about the fact that it is bipartisan. You have to have 3 individuals at every table, and no table can have this all one political party. So it might be a mixed composition of libertarians, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated voters, because Arizona is about a third and a third of each of those 3 major parties. So it's very transparent about who is auditing the ballot. And I will also say that everyone has to take a sworn oath. In the same way that poll workers do, the auditors have to stand up and swear under penalty of perjury that they are going to, in fact, uphold the Arizona and the United States Constitution against all adversaries, foreign and domestic. This exercise that's happening at the Coliseum, we have no idea what the hiring process was. I will tell you there are some individuals that are listed. There's a video that's out on Twitter today from Mr. John Brakey. I'm very familiar with Mr. Brakey from my days in Maricopa County. He and a counterpart used to refer to themselves as mayhem and chaos. And they caused a lot of issues around the elections, both in California and in Maricopa County in about 2009 through 2013 or so. He's now listed as one of the state liaisons to the Senate on behalf of the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party did not select him. The party was not involved in any way in staffing the individuals doing the audit, nor is there a commitment that this audit will be done in a bipartisan manner. In fact, I've spoken to Mr. Bennett, and he has said that they're trying to, but they can't really commit that it won't all be one party at a table reviewing the ballots. This should be disconcerting to everyone involved.
Thank you, Tammy. To close out, let's squeeze in one last question. Stephanie Becker with CNN asks, the Brennan Center has requested DOJ observers. Is this a realistic possibility? What do y'all think?
Let's hope so. I mean, I think the more observers there are, the more credible the process. I don't think you can make this process credible at this point. The cows left the barn a long time ago. But at least you would have people that are familiar with federal laws and lawyers looking at it and bringing in the questions that need to be asked. And the fact that this isn't bipartisan is problematic up and down this whole process.
I didn't know if you wanted to jump in there, Matt. I will say that I had the great fortune when I worked in Maricopa County to work under the tutelage of former County Recorder Helen Purcell. And we embraced and welcomed observers from the Department of Justice. We made sure they had full access. We answered any questions they had. We trained our board workers and our poll work, we call them board workers in Arizona, poll workers on how to answer questions, make sure that they answer all the questions of the Department of Justice, be transparent with everything. So I think that's one facet of this. because there have been such restrictions placed on who can observe this election process at the Coliseum, it's not even an election process. I'm struggling with what to call it in public. So I will say that part of the challenge is that you have to be a registered voter in Maricopa County. You have to submit a resume. You have to submit 3 letters of recommendation. And nowhere have we seen what the criteria are or who is the final determinant on who is to be an observer and who is not. If you ask Mr. Bennett, he says it's Senator Fenn. If you ask the Senate President, she says it's Mr. Bennett. And stuck in between, sometimes they'll say it's the cyber ninjas. So that's part of the challenge here, is that we need to have observance. And some will say, oh, but it's being streamed online 24/7. If you've looked at those camera shots, can you really see anything? Does it really tell you what it is that you're viewing? And so I think that, what are they hiding? Why don't they want to have DOJ observers there? In the same way that we get the question of why are they afraid of this count? Why are you afraid to have election observers? Why are you afraid to have open press? Why are you restricting the press to 6 hours a day? All of those things can just be turned on the face and ask the same questions right back at them.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Wyman, Matt, and Tammy, for taking the time to speak to the details of this audit in Arizona moving forward. And to our audience, thanks so much for being with us. For the questions we didn't get to, please know we'll follow up. Feel free to use any of the participants' responses in your reporting, and please also reach out to us afterwards if you have follow-ups for specific panelists. And finally, please refer to our website, electiontaskforce.org, for resources from the task force. With that, thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.